Before we start, make sure you subscribe and like this video. I'm blind and operate an elevator for a living. My passengers keep disappearing. Last year, when my 10-year prison stint was finally up and I re-entered society, I encountered some obstacles. Obstacles like lack of upward mobility, prejudices and stigmas, wages and earnings lower than the general population, undesirable and oftentimes dangerous jobs, and lack of protection from wrongful termination, not to mention an already tough job market, and the fact that my parole required that I maintain steady employment or face re-incarceration, which is why when I finally got a job offer, after 6 months of aggressive job hunting, I jumped at the opportunity, giving absolutely no fucks as to how I was actually making ends meet. Ever operate a freight elevator before? Mr. Winfred, the manager of the Cornelius and my new boss, asked me my first day on the job. No, sir, I replied honestly as I ran my fingers along the doors of the antiquated contraption, the only remaining evidence of the recently renovated luxury building's ancient past. Normally, these old things aren't used for passengers, but the building's pretentious designers thought it might add a certain charm to its otherwise sterile decor, which is where you come in, he continued, as I heard him slide open the freight elevator's outside doors. Slam, followed by its scissored metal inside doors. Screech! I heard Mr. Winfred step inside and, using my cane, scanned the interior of the rather large elevator, which must have been 8 feet by 8 feet, and followed him in. Instantly, my nose was hit with an overpowering, musty scent, like the kind you'd smell in a basement, combined with your grandmother's attic. He then closed both doors behind us. Slam, screech. Now this here, Mr. Winfred added, taking my hand and placing it on the handle of a lever, is how you move the elevator from floor to floor, up for up, down for down. You'll hear a click when you reach each floor, which will be helpful for someone like yourself, he said, clearly calling attention to the fact that I'm blind. Someone like myself, I scoffed internally. You ignorant, entitled piece of shit. Truth is, I've always had a bit of a short fuse, which I guess, looking back on it, is what got me into prison in the first place. But in my 10 years of incarceration, I was given tools to combat my anger issues. Tools like reminding myself that it was nothing new. Assholes like him were always dropping unintentional microaggressions. It had been something I had grown used to, and given my probation, wasn't a battle worth fighting. Yes, sir, I replied through my teeth as I begrudgingly swallowed my pride. Now, why don't you spend today practicing? Our first residents don't move in until tomorrow. In just a matter of a week or so, as the doors of the Cornelius opened to its new tenants, I learned pretty much everything I needed to know about the job. Said tenants were rich, very rich, and most of them acted as such, entitled, obnoxious, holier than thou, especially given my own social class. But a few of them weren't so bad and tipped well. Mr. Winfred's assistant, Jane, was a lovely human being, patient, kind, thoughtful, understanding, especially when compared to both the building's uptight residents and Mr. Winfred himself. It had been years since I had dated, and the very thought of meeting a partner stressed me out to no end. But if I was to find someone, I hoped she'd be like Jane. The elevator didn't open on the basement level. As I'd learned countless times, it was possible to go there, but the doors simply wouldn't open. The old freight itself was finicky as fuck. Stop the lever 1 second too early or 1 second too late, and when the doors open, you're halfway between a floor. But eventually, I got used to it, to the point where most of the building's tenants assumed the role of freight operator had always been my job. And when you're good at your service job and do it with a smile on your face, the tips start flowing. And so, all was well for the first couple of weeks on the job. A seemingly refreshing return to normalcy after 10 long years, until the disappearances started happening. I was just arriving to work one day when I heard about the first disappearance. Have you been in contact with Elizabeth Davis from room 401? Mr. Winfred asked, after correcting himself, something he did often, which continued to annoy me. I replied, unsure of where he was going with the question. Not since yesterday. She got back from work, and I brought her up to the 4th floor. But come to think of it, I don't think she rode the elevator down this morning, like she usually does. Interesting, my boss replied, before continuing. She disappeared yesterday. Disappeared? I asked. Yeah, husband said she never came home last night. Brought her to the 4th floor. Did you check the hallway surveillance footage? Not yet. Unfortunately, the building inspector's in today, and I won't have time until tomorrow. Let's hope she just went somewhere, or got lost. In the meantime, keep an eye out. Just let me know if you hear of anything suspicious. Yes, sir, I replied, once again resisting the urge to snap on him before heading for the elevator where I started the day's shift. Slam, screech. That day, I did my best to do as Mr. Winfred had asked and listen carefully for any signs of mischief. But the day went on, business as usual, and by the end of the day, I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, except the only thing of note was a difference in Mr. Lawrence's demeanor. The tenant of room 805, he was a salesman and acted like one. When I say the man could talk, the man could talk, to a point where whenever he was a passenger in the old freight elevator, despite the long ride from floor 1 to floor 8, I'd rarely have a chance to get a word in. But this time was different. This time, Mr. Lawrence entered the elevator, chatting away, just as he always did. But about halfway up, he just stopped talking. And the thing about my job is if someone chooses to talk or not talk, it's their decision and none of my business. So I left him alone, and when we reached the 8th floor, I simply said goodnight, to which he didn't reply. Must be going through something, I thought to myself, having been unable to truly get a sense of his composure without being able to see him, before closing the double doors and heading off to help the next passenger. Slam, screech. Later that night, Mr. Winfred called me into his office and asked me to take a seat beside his assistant, Jane. Mr. Owens, are you aware of the situation that's going on in the building? He asked in an interrogating tone. Yes, you told me about it yesterday. The disappearance, sir, I replied. Disappearances now, plural, he said sternly. But who else? I asked. Mr. Lawrence. What happened to him? Well, to be honest, I was hoping you could tell me. 'Cause much like Miss Davis, the last place he was seen was going into your elevator. What about the cameras in the hallways? I'm afraid that after reviewing the tapes, after stepping into your elevator, neither Miss Davis or Mr. Lawrence ever stepped out. But that's not possible. Mr. Owens, I'm going to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you want to tell me? I know you have a sordid past. Mr. Winfred, Jane interjected, clearly offended by his words and implications. Quiet, Jane, he scolded before continuing. Answer the question, Mr. Owens. I didn't know what to say. I was so shocked, so flustered by what he was implying that I simply froze. Mr. Owens, he screamed. I don't know, I cried out as I heard Jane squirm in her seat. I'm telling you, the last time I heard from either of them, I took them up to their floors. But you're what? Blind? Well, yes, sir. I don't see what goes on inside the elevator. I just let them on and off. Mr. Owens, if they got on your elevator and never got off, where could they possibly have gone? I don't know, I replied at this point, wanting to grab him by force, demand that he never speak to me that way again, and scream out my innocence. But my next parole appointment was the following week, so once again, all I could do was just bite my tongue. Mr. Winfred paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and regained his composure. Mr. Owens, I could go to the police now, and that would be very bad for someone like you. Fuck. He's right, I thought to myself, realizing that if he went to the police and I was even remotely suspected of what was going on in the building, it was back to prison for me. But lucky for you, he continued, there are things going on in the building that I wouldn't want to bring unwanted attention to, and for that reason, I have decided not to go to the police yet. But consider this a warning, and know that I have a repairman coming first thing tomorrow morning to install a security camera inside the freight elevator, so I can see what exactly it is that you're doing in there. I had no idea how to react to Mr. Winfred's continued accusations, so I simply remained silent. Now, get out of here and go home. We'll reconvene on this tomorrow, he said dismissively, before Jane walked me out of the room, down the hall, and outside the building, where I planned to return home for the night. 15 minutes later, we were at a bar down the street, where Jane apparently frequented. But where could they possibly have gone? I asked her, my hands trembling at both the thought of people disappearing in the elevator and that it was happening under my watch. Thing is, Jane said as she finished her beer, there's something you should know about the building. The Cornelius? No, from before it was called that. It used to be a factory of some kind. Is that what Mr. Winfred was talking about when he said that there were things going on in the building that he didn't want to bring unwanted attention to? Well, yes and no. Yes, in a sense, that Mr. Winfred cut some corners, and rather than fully renovate the entire warehouse, he simply walled off entire sections of the old structure, like the basement. And no, in a sense, that even Mr. Winfred doesn't know what's really going on in the elevator. Sure, it'd be easy to pin it on you, especially with your criminal record, no offense. But even he knows that it's probably something else. Something else. See, that's where things get hazy, because no one knows what exactly went on at the factory before it became the Cornelius. But rumors have it, it was a laboratory of some kind, and some fucked up shit went on inside there. Like what? That, my friend, I don't know. But what I do know is I better be getting to bed. Fair enough. Well, thanks for the drink and the support, I said with a smile as we made our way out of the bar. Yeah, don't let Mr. Winfred get to you, and try not to worry too much. Contrary to Jane's suggestion, that night I worried a lot about the disappearances, what might be causing them, whatever may have gone on in the factory, and most importantly, about everything getting pinned on me, I couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning in bed as my mind raced. And each time I finally passed out, I'd wake up in a panic attack, my heart pounding, short of breath and in a cold sweat. But it didn't stop there. The uncomfortable feeling of terror and fear, accompanied by the vibrating sensation of adrenaline pumping through my body, remained well into the next morning when I stepped back into the elevator, terrified by what might be going on inside there. Please don't leave me alone in this fucking thing, I thought to myself. And within a matter of minutes, my prayers were answered. How goes it? The surveillance installation worker called out, his cheery disposition contrary to mine. Not too bad, I replied, lying through my teeth as he stepped inside. But after a minute or two of sharing the elevator with him, my fears lessened and my body relaxed, comforted by the positive conversation and the metallic clinking sounds of the installation. Everything's okay. The doors are open, and he's talking, I thought to myself. But eventually, the man finished installing the camera and began wrapping up the job. Well, that's it. Camera's all installed and running now, he called out. Let's just take the elevator for a spin and make sure we don't lose the signal. Yes, of course, I replied, before reaching for the double doors. Slam, screech, and moving the lever up, we started moving. Fascinating job, I must say, elevator operator, but I suppose you could say the same for mine. Pays the bills, I replied, feigning a chuckle. If he's here, and he's talking, then I'm safe, I continued to reassure myself. But a few minutes into our ascent, just like Mr. Lawrence, the man suddenly stopped talking. All right, looks like it's working fine. We can head back down and... Silence. Hello? I asked, but he didn't respond. Fuck, I thought to myself, realizing that whatever caused Miss Davis and Mr. Lawrence, and seemingly now the repairman to disappear, could still be in the elevator with me. Standing there, shaking, sweat rolling down my brow, I backed myself into the corner of the elevator as I reached for the lever, pressed it down, and the elevator began to make its descent back to the ground floor. When I finally reached the lobby, ding! I scrambled to open the doors. Slam, screech, and darted out, gasping for air, expecting to find a safe haven. But instead, all I heard was the sound of Mr. Winfred's voice. Where is the repairman? A few minutes later, I was once again sitting in Mr. Winfred's office, next to Jane, this time attempting to explain what had happened. And then he stopped talking, just like Mr. Lawrence. You know what, Mr. Owens, I'm tired of your excuses. And now that we have a working camera in the elevator, it's time to find out what's really going on inside there, he threatened, as I heard him clicking away on his computer, clearly reviewing the footage. Please do, I cried out. I'm telling you, it's not me. That's when Mr. Winfred and Jane both went silent. Hello? I called out, unable to see what was really going on. Given the fact that my passengers had recently been going silent, the thought crossed my mind that they too had disappeared, but I could still hear their breathing in the room. Breathing that sounded like it was increasing rapidly, until they broke the silence. Oh my, Jane said, struggling to catch her breath. That can't be. Let me rewind the tape. Mr. Winfred mumbled, the most scared I had ever heard him. What is it? I asked, as they seemingly played back the video. I would later find out from Jane that the footage would show myself and the repairman in the elevator as a slithering, grotesque, humanoid figure suddenly climbed down from the roof of the elevator, wrapped its slimy arms around the repairman, and somehow hopped back out of the elevator and pulled the man up with it, leaving me standing there, completely unaware of what had just happened. But in that moment, Mr. Winfred must have realized the complications associated with reporting such a bizarre phenomenon, and instead decided to finally pin it on me. "Mr. Owens, you shouldn't have done that," he cried out. "Mr. Winfred, what are you talking about?" Jane asked. "You and I just watched the same footage." That's when I heard him drag a file to his computer's trash and delete it. Crunch. "Stay out of this, Jane. This man has killed 3 people in the elevator. I knew I shouldn't have hired an ex-con." "But sir, I didn't," I tried to reply before he interrupted. "Mr. Owens, I'm picking up the phone and calling the police. I'd suggest you just stay put." "But Mr. Winfred, I'm telling you, I didn't do anything." "Yes, is this 911? I'm the manager of the Cornelius, and I'd like to report 3 murders in my building." "We'd better go," I heard Jane say, as I felt her place her hand on my shoulder. "And yes, I have reason to believe the killer is our elevator operator, an ex-convict who is sitting right in front of me." "Come on, let's go," Jane screamed. As she tugged at my shirt, I hopped up from my seat, and she led me out of the office, down the hall, and into, of all places, the old freight elevator, as she explained to me what she had seen on the surveillance tape. "Slam! Screech!" "Take us to the basement," Jane called out. "But the basement is walled off," I replied. "Just do it," she insisted, before I moved the lever down and the elevator began to move. I spent the ride catching my breath until we finally reached the basement level. "Dang. Now what?" I asked, but Jane didn't reply. "Jane? Oh fuck," I thought to myself. The monster. That's when I turned to the center of the freight elevator, where Jane had been standing, reached out into the unknown, and sure enough, felt the cold, slimy skin of the creature wrapped around Jane's face, preventing her from making a sound. Not knowing what else to do, I gripped its disgusting appendages with both hands and slowly pried it off Jane as she let out a scream, and the monster's arm quickly slithered away, back up through the roof of the freight. Jane dropped to the ground, coughing violently. "You okay?" I asked her, but rather than responding, she simply handed me something. I opened my fist to find a pair of keys. "The lock above the lever. Unlock it," she instructed, still coughing, as I felt around the lever, found the lock, inserted the key, and unlocked it. Click. "The doors, they should open now," Jane said, as she stood up, having finally caught her breath. Screech! Slam! We arrived in the dark basement to smell the same musty odor from the freight elevator. After her eyes adjusted and she scanned our surroundings, Jane informed me that this floor looked nothing like the other 8 newly renovated floors with their modern feel and minimalistic designs. Instead, the basement was a window into the building's former self, when it had been a factory. Its walls brick and crumbling, its floors concrete and cracked, and scattered everywhere were the dusty remnants of laboratory equipment, devices, machines, tanks, most of which were destroyed or disconnected or both. "What went on down here?" I asked. "From the looks of it, something inhumane," Jane said, after she picked up a few tattered pieces of paper from one of the lab stations and told me what was on it. The first page looks like some sort of a diagram of a man being pumped with chemicals from tanks, and the second, a drawing of the creature from the elevator. In pencil beside it, someone appears to have labeled it the Silencer. Silencer, I thought to myself, before remembering that the creature seemed to always silence the sounds of its victims and to have been repulsed by Jane's scream. At the same time, it had never bothered me in the elevator, as I tended to stand there in silence. But before I could dwell too much on the thought, Jane interrupted. "If you don't mind my asking, what did you go to prison for in the first place?" she asked. "It's okay," I said, surprised she had waited this long to ask, before contemplating the best way to explain what had happened. "'Cause of my temper. Some guy was being a dick on the train platform. We got into a scuffle, and he accidentally fell into the tracks." "Over what? Did he insult you? Your blindness?" "No, I'm afraid not," I replied. "We were drunk and arguing over a basketball game. Of all things, he was my friend." "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." "It's okay." Jane put her hand on my shoulder, and we stood there in silence for a moment, until suddenly we heard the sound of Mr. Winfred and the police approaching as they ran down what must have been a hidden set of stairs from the ground level to the basement. "Come on, follow me," Jane called out, as she took me by the hand and led me into what I'd soon discover was a labyrinthian network of old passages, while the police and Mr. Winfred both called out to us, "This is the police. Put your hands on your head and turn yourself in. You're trapped, Mr. Owens. Just confess your crimes and you'll simply go back to jail." We continued to run deeper and deeper into the passages as our pursuers began to close in on us, their footsteps getting closer and closer and closer, until suddenly the sound of their footsteps was replaced by that of screaming, and they suddenly went silent. "What the?" Jane whispered. "The creature," I whispered. "It must be down here." That's when we hatched a plan. Having found our way out of the labyrinth and back to the entrance of the laboratory, where we had arrived in the old freight elevator, I found myself standing alone, waiting, as I nervously tapped my cane on the basement floor, Jane having gone off on her own. That's when I heard Mr. Winfred emerge from the passages alone and call out to me, "Mr. Owens, there's nowhere to run. Even your beloved elevator is gone. You're cornered," he taunted as I backed towards the elevator and tapped at it with my cane. Its doors open, its shaft empty. "What did you say?" I asked, encouraging him to talk louder. "What are you, deaf now too?" the ignorant old man snapped back. "I said, you have nowhere to run." "I'm sorry, you'll have to forgive me," I said sarcastically, pointing to my ears. "Can you repeat that again?" That's when Mr. Winfred began approaching and screamed, "You worthless ex-con. I knew I shouldn't have hired you in the first place, and now you'll go back to where you belong." But suddenly, Mr. Winfred went silent, as the creature must have wrapped its slimy tentacles around his face. That's when I seized the opportunity, ran over to Mr. Winfred, gripped the cold body of the creature, which was indeed wrapped around him, turned, and flung them both behind me into the hollow elevator shaft. Slam! Before hitting the up button on the wall and calling the freight elevator down. Suddenly, the gears of the elevator above could be heard turning away, and the machine began its quick descent down. "Mr. Owens, no!" Mr. Winfred cried out, clearly now separated from the creature. I froze for a moment as my mind raced back to the night of the tragic accident when my friend called out to me from the train tracks and I was unable to save him in time, until I eventually snapped myself out of it and willed myself to save Mr. Winfred, no matter how evil the asshole's intentions may have been, reaching out my hand out and pulling him up and out of the elevator just as the freight car came crash down to the basement level. Slam, crunch, rah! The slimy beast cried out as it was crushed under the old elevator's weight. Ding! The basement fell silent for a moment until screech, slam. Jane stepped out and said, "Going up?" But the joke was met with silence. I simply stood there, shaking, as Mr. Winfred did the same, clearly shocked by the events that had just occurred. A few weeks later, after the authorities had done a full sweep of the basement and cleared out all traces of the building old laboratory, I found myself once again back in the manager's office. "Mr. Owens, this is the last time I'm gonna tell you this," Jane joked as I heard her recline back in what was once Mr. Winfred's chair, having been named interim manager since her boss's recent and ironic prison sentencing. "Who's the convict now?" I said with a smile, before making my way out of the office. "Wait," Jane said, stopping me at the door. "You sure you want to go back to operating the elevator? After all that's happened, like I said, the doorman job is yours if you want it." "What's the worst that could happen?" I replied with a smile. "There's another one of those creatures in the building somewhere." I drive trucks for a dairy farm in northern Alberta. Something strange is going on up here. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what a biogas plant is, how it works, or what they're actually used for, allow me to educate you. A biogas plant produces natural gas, or rather a substitute for natural gas, from fermented corn silage, as well as other agricultural waste products. Farmers, such as myself, would bring in silage which we would unload into a large concrete bunker silo. Basically, just a big walled-in pit. The plant I delivered to used a modified snowcat to push the silage around and pack it down evenly in the pit. Once one pit filled up, they would top it and leave it to ferment and move on to the next pit. Once a pit was fully fermented, they would uncover it and use a large wheel loader to shovel the fermented silage into what's called an anaerobic digester. It's basically just a big tank with an agitator that you fill up with a bunch of organic matter and heat it up, which produces methane gas. As the microorganisms inside begin to break everything down, this gas is then captured and can be used for basically everything. Natural gas is used for already, but it's supposed to be better for the environment or something. These plants are way more common in Europe, but they have started to pop up here in North America as well. And yes, before you ask, these places smell worse than you could possibly imagine. I always thought it was a little bit weird that they built one way up here in northern Alberta, but since the large dairy farm I worked at pretty much always had an excess of corn silage every year, we certainly welcomed another place to sell it to, especially since they're not picky. Trying to sell to another dairy farmer is always a hassle because they're always concerned with the quality, as they should be if they're feeding it to their cows. But the biogas plant basically just needs organic matter. It doesn't really matter what it is. If it can decompose, you can make gas out of it. Last fall, we had an exceptionally good corn harvest, to the point where we still had 4 more fields still to harvest by the time we had enough to feed the cows for the next year. As I said, This isn't uncommon. When you're harvesting corn for silage, you use a totally different harvester. Rather than a combine that separates out the actual corn kernels from the rest of the plant, you use a forage harvester, which is essentially a giant wood chipper on wheels that takes in the whole crop and shreds it up. Since corn can easily grow 10 feet high and you spread that over a few thousand acres, you get a crazy high volume of silage coming in. Upon realizing how much excess we had, my boss did what he always did and called up the plant, who has always agreed to take in what we didn't need. The next morning, rather than trucking back to the farm, we were instructed to head straight over to the plant once our trailers had filled up. I arrived with my first load at the plant around 10 a.m. A man wearing a high-vis jacket directed me onto the large scale they use to weigh the trucks coming in and out. "Good harvest this year, Jim?" the friendly old lady in the scale house said as she took down the weight of my loaded truck. I felt bad as I had been delivering to this plant on and off. For the last 8 years, I had worked on Mr. Baker's dairy farm, but I couldn't remember, or I just never learned her name. Oh well, I certainly wasn't going to out myself now. "Well, if we're delivering here, you know it's a good one," I replied, "and there's plenty more where this came from." "Glad to hear it." She smiled back at me, handing me my paperwork. "Now you just head right on down to the back there, and the boys will show you where to dump." "Thank you," I said, taking the papers from her and putting my truck back into gear. I pulled off the scale and made my way to the back of the plant, where the big concrete pits are. Some more men in high-vis gear directed me to back into a specific one. The giant pit was only about half full at this point, but the mountain of silage in my rearview mirrors still looked to be about 30 feet deep at its highest point. As usual, they had me back up until my trailer started to climb the pile a bit. This way, there were no gaps in the pile, and the snowcat wouldn't have to do as much pushing. As I watched the back wheels of my trailer roll onto the silage pile in my mirrors, I heard the unmistakable sound of a tire blowing out, a loud pop, and then a slow hiss that quickly dissipated. "Shit," I thought to myself as I hopped out to inspect the damage. One of the workers had also come to see what had happened. "Must be one of your inside tires," he said to me as I approached. "All the outside ones look fine." I bent down and looked under the truck. Sure enough, he was right. The inside tire on the right side of the rear axle was completely flat. "Well, I suppose that's why semi-trucks have dual wheels," I said, trying to sound unfazed, while simultaneously preparing myself for the ass-chewing I was bound to receive for this later. I walked around to the back of the truck to inspect the damage further and saw what had punctured my tire. I stumbled back a bit as I realized it was what appeared to be a broken bone sticking out of the tire. "What the?" I said, mostly to myself, but the worker must have heard too, as it caused him to look down at it as well. When he did, his face went white for a second. Then he composed himself. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "I've been here since the plant opened, and I ain't never seen that before. Some, poor animal must have gone through the forage harvester, or, some farmer's dog must have dug it up and dropped it in their silo." He seemed real shifty as he said this, and almost seemed like he was trying to convince himself of what he was saying, but I brushed it off, as I figured he was probably just as shocked as I was. While I was still able to unload, I did have to leave the truck and trailer at the plant that night. A mobile tire repair service would be out in the morning to get it all fixed up. I got a ride back to the farm with our next truck to arrive at the plant and finished out the day pressure, washing the manure spreaders. No doubt a reward for my efforts that day. I had to take a good long shower at the farm office before getting in my truck to head home for the night. As I started the engine, I went to pull my phone out of my pocket to plug it in to the charger and realized that I didn't have it. I patted all my other pockets. Nope, definitely not there. I then realized that I had likely left it in the semi, which was now at the plant, probably locked behind a gate for the night. Logically, I could have just waited till morning to go and retrieve it. I was probably just going to go straight to bed when I got home anyway, so what did I need my phone for? But because humans now have separation, anxiety from their phones burned into them at age 3, I found myself pulling out onto the road in the direction of the plant rather than home. I hoped there would be some friendly night security guard that would let me in to grab it, and I'd be on my way in 5 minutes. I reached the plant just as it was getting dark, and indeed there was a security guard standing at the gate as I pulled up. A very heavily armed security guard. He had what looked like a military rifle slung over his back, and I wondered what on earth he needed that for. They were very illegal for civilians to own here in the Great White North, so they must have had a damn good reason to arm their security like this for the government to let them do it. He looked rather intimidating, but surprisingly was not at all antagonistic when I rolled down my window. "Are you lost, partner?" he said in a rather friendly tone. No, I work for one of the farms that delivers here," I said. "My truck blew a tire on the trailer earlier today, and it's still sitting over by pit 3, and I think I left my phone in the cab. Do you mind if I go check?" He gave me a suspicious look. Then he peered into the pickup bed and generally looked over me and my truck. Then he gazed off down the road and looked at his watch. "All right, you got 10 minutes, and try and stay out of the night shift's way," he said in a much less friendly tone. A loud click and then a buzzing sound came from the gate as it began to move, and I drove through it. By now, it was almost completely dark, but the large spotlights of the plant made it easy to navigate. I came around the corner and saw my truck still sitting across from pit 3, and I pulled up in front of it. As I got out, I noticed that there was a large excavator up on top of the pile in pit 4. I knew it was digging into the silage, but I couldn't really see what it was doing properly because the concrete wall that separated pits 3 and 4 partially obscured it. I could also see the roof of the snowcat peeking up over the wall. It must have been parked a little ways away on top of the pile, and I figured it must have gotten stuck, and they were using the excavator to try and get it out. I paid it little attention as I entered the cab of the semi-truck and quickly found my phone in the cup holder. I grabbed it, and just as I was climbing down, a voice called out to me, "Hey, who the fuck are you? And what are you doing here?" A disgruntled-looking worker wearing the same high-vis gear was running towards me. "I just left my phone in this truck here. The security guard let me in to grab it," I stammered, backing up towards my pickup. "Of course he fucking did," the man grumbled, and he snatched his radio out of his jacket pocket. "Peter, what the hell did you let this dumbass in here? For you can't be doing that," he shouted into the radio. "Relax, they're not even here yet," the guard's voice crackled through the radio. Actually, I see headlights. If he's got his phone, tell him to get out of there." The man looked back to me. "You heard him, son. Get lost and don't come back here after delivery hours again. You got it?" I nodded and climbed back into my pickup truck and began to drive back towards the gate. As I exited, the guard waved to me from behind the big black GMC Yukon that had pulled up to the gate. He appeared to be talking to the driver. There was a large U-Haul truck behind it, followed by another black Yukon. As I passed the last vehicle, I noticed in my rear view mirror the 3 trucks enter the plant ad, the guard shutting the gate behind them. That whole situation did not sit right with me. On the drive home, I contemplated everything that I had seen and heard from the guard and the other worker. They were up to something in that plant at night that maybe even the bosses didn't know about. My best guess was it was some kind of drug operation. If movies have taught me anything, drug kingpins always drive black SUVs. I know I should have left it alone, but life up here in northern Alberta was so boring, my curiosity ended up getting the better of me. I thought that I could help bring down some kind of criminal organization and be a local hero. In that worst case scenario, nothing was happening and nothing would come of it. After harvest concluded, I had a couple of days off to rest as we'd been working pretty crazy hours lately. I, however, did not rest. I was trying to find out everything I could about the plant and the people who ran it. I really couldn't find anything about it. In fact, it was as if the place didn't exist. You would think there would at least be a news story from when they built the place, what with it being the biggest boost to the local economy and job market our town had ever seen, and all but there was nothing. Finally, I decided the only thing to do was to see if I could observe what those black SUVs and the U-Haul truck were doing in the plant at night. Maybe get some photos of the exchange and hand them off to the police. I did some poking around on Google Maps and found an old logging road that ran across the ridge behind the plant. There was a little dirt area where people often parked to unload their ATVs to go riding in the woods up there that was maybe only a kilometer or so from the north side of the plant. I drove up there just before dark and hiked down through the woods all the way to the north fence of the plant. It was just a chain link fence like you'd see around a schoolyard, not a barbed wire prison fence or anything, so I made quick work of climbing over it. Luckily for me, there was a lot of equipment and old dumpsters and shipping containers in this part of the plant for me to hide behind as I made my way towards where the main gate was. I crouched down behind one of their company trucks parked near the gate and waited about 20 minutes before I saw the black SUVs pull up. This time though, they didn't have a U-Haul. They had a much larger yellow Penske box truck. They must be hauling some serious product to be renting that thing. I watched as the trucks rolled through the gate, and much like they had done with me a few days prior, the plant workers in high-vis gear directed them back towards the pits. I began to sneak my way over there, being careful to stay out of sight. I realized very quickly that I wouldn't be able to get very close while still remaining hidden. The area around the pits was largely wide open to allow it to turn around and back in, so there was nothing to conceal me as I approached. I noticed the office nearby and had an idea. I snuck over to it and tried the door. It was open, but the lights were off inside. Luckily, no alarms went off, and I found what I came for quickly: a high-vis uniform and a white hard hat laying on the break room table. I also grabbed some safety glasses and a dust mask, as it wasn't uncommon for the workers to wear them. There was a lot of dust around the pits, and I figured it would help conceal my identity. After putting on the uniform and sneaking back outside, I observed the workers for a few minutes to see what they were doing and how best to blend in. Most of them appeared to either be standing around watching the trucks pull up or walking somewhere, so I figured just walking like I was on a mission was good enough. Turns out, I didn't need to fake it for long. As I neared the yellow Penske truck, I saw some men getting out of the black SUVs. They were dressed in what looked like church robes, but definitely not Catholic, since they didn't have the collar. One of them turned to me, and I froze. "Hey buddy, we got a pretty big load tonight. Mind giving us a hand?" Realizing my cover was working, I decided to play along and just leave the part about me helping the drug lords out of my statement to the police. I nodded and walked over with the other workers and awaited instructions. I heard the sound of a diesel engine coming closer and looked over to see the excavator I had seen coming around the corner and begin to climb the silage pile in pit 4 again. The snowcat was behind it, but instead of following the excavator up the pile, it came towards us. It had some kind of large metal box attached to the blade that was about the size of a small car. The operator set the box down next to the Penske truck and hopped out. The same disgruntled man I had encountered the other night got out of the cab. "Jesus, man, that's a big truck you got there. Probably gonna take a couple trips to unload this thing," he said to the men in robes. One of them opened up the back of the box truck, and where I expected to see a giant pile of cocaine bricks or something, there was something I never expected. Bodies, and lots of them, just thrown haphazardly into the back of this truck. I had to fight the urge to fill my dust mask with vomit as I saw them. The workers began loading them into the box on the blade of the snowcat, just tossing them on with little regard for how they landed. No one seemed to notice me, just standing there, so I slowly backed up into the shadows and made my way over to pit 3. It was almost full by now, so I climbed up the pile to a spot where I could look over the concrete wall into pit 4, where the excavator was without being spotted. Once up there, I saw the snowcat climbing up the pile towards a large hole the excavator had dug in it. There were some more workers up there who began throwing the bodies off into the hole as one of the men in robes climbed out of the passenger seat in the snowcat. He just stood on the track watching as the bodies were piled into this impromptu mass grave they had constructed. He stayed up on the pile while the snowcat went down for the second load. This was all starting to make sense now. This was the perfect cover for disposing of bodies. They would get broken down in the pile same as everything else, and because they were constantly being emptied into the digester, the evidence would only be around for a few months, and the horrific smell of the plant would conceal any foul odors produced by the dead bodies. But there was one question left. Where were they coming from? This was way too many bodies for this to be the mafia or something killing off problematic individuals. By the time the truck was totally unloaded, there must have been 100 dead people in that hole. No, this had to be some cult activities of some sort, and the robes the men from the black SUVs were wearing backed up that theory. Maybe these were just what was left over from some sort of ritual sacrifice or something. Whoever these people are, they must have some kind of deal with the plant's owners, because I could tell the workers had done this before. From the time the truck had arrived to the time the excavator started burying the corpses in rotting corn silage, it had only taken about half an hour. I didn't even bother ditching the uniform I got out of that plant as fast as I could. I sprinted up through those woods, back towards my truck, with my heart beating so fast I thought it would explode. As soon as I was in the truck, I locked all the doors and dialed 911 on speaker as I peeled out of the forest. I told the operator everything that had happened over the last couple of days and what I had seen that night. I practically begged them to send someone there right away, which the nice lady on the other end of the line promised they would. She asked for my name and contact information so they could get a hold of me for a statement, which I gladly gave them. She assured me they would investigate the matter, and I thanked her and hung up the phone. I then pulled over and got out of the truck and proceeded to finally let out all the vomit I had been holding in for the last hour or so. I ditched the plant uniform on the side of that old forest road and made my way for home. As I was approaching my house, I saw a car up ahead. As I drew closer, I could make out the distinctive reflective tape they put across the back of police cars. I slowed down as I had come up on him pretty fast, and I didn't want to get a speeding ticket after all I'd been through that night. I followed the cop a few more kilometers towards town. My house was on this road coming up shortly. As we approached my driveway, the cop put his signal on to turn in. I breathed a sigh of relief as I guessed they had sent someone out to check on me, and I was about to put my signal on as well when I noticed the black GMC Yukon parked in my driveway and the man in robe standing next to it with a gun. The cop turned in and parked next to him. Given that the cop had basically zero reaction to the man standing there with a weapon, my heart sank as I realized whatever this is runs much deeper than I thought, and revealing who I was to that 911 dispatcher had just domed me. I kept on driving, praying that neither of them recognized me, and thanking the Alberta government for not requiring front license plates that the cop would have totally seen on the drive over otherwise. I just kept on driving, expecting at any minute to see police lights behind me or a big black SUV blocking the road ahead of me and men in dark robes coming out of the darkness to get me, but nothing happened. I don't even know how long I drove for. I just drove until I had to pee so badly I was forced to stop at a truck stop and realized I was somewhere in Saskatchewan. I've been on the run, so to speak now, for about 6 months. I don't know if anyone's even following me, but I have to be sure. I'm writing this all out to get it off my chest and out there as a warning. Before I ditch this phone and start my life over in another province, as far away from there as I can get. I don't know what's going on up there, but there is something very dark happening in northern Alberta, and I probably only scratched the surface of it. Either way, I want no part of any of it. Please subscribe and like the video. Also comment your favorite horror movie so I can stay motivated to upload more videos like this